Morning, everyone. What I'd like to do at the beginning of this session every day is introduce a new practice, meditation practice, that then you'll be continuing to practice a little bit later with Felipe. So yesterday evening we gave a brief introduction into this, what's called shamatha practice, this practice of simply cultivating a calm, clear, focused mind. And we saw there that the foundation for this practice, well actually the foundation for any meditation practice is relaxation. And so to really emphasize just initially cultivating a relaxed body and a relaxed mind. And so we saw there yesterday that one of the shamatha practices that's very helpful for doing this is what's called this full body breath practice. Is simply noticing sensations anywhere in the body connected with the breathing. There's another practice very similar to that I'd like to introduce now. We'll practice a little bit, and that is to focus on the rhythm of the breath. Is just to become aware of the rhythm of the breath. Noticing, for example, if the breathing is slow or fast, deep or shallow, long or short. And of course in this practice we're not trying to control the breath, because there can be this tendency in actually meditation in general that people feel like, oh, actually if I'm meditating well I need to have my breathing very rhythmic or very subtle or very deep or something. So people try to force their breath in that way. So we don't want to do that in this practice, in any shamatha practice. Because often what happens is people try to make their breathing more subtle, and then at some point in the meditation they go, because they're not breathing enough. So that's a sure sign we're trying to force the breath or manipulate the breath. So we don't want to do that in this practice. Let the breathing do whatever it needs to do. So in this practice here, the rhythm of the breath, we're not trying to make the breath rhythmic or subtle or deep or anything. We're just noticing what it's doing. Is it slow? Is it fast? Is it deep? Is it shallow? Is it long? Is it short? That's all. We're just noticing that. But this is a bit of a challenge because, particularly in our modern society, we like to control things. And if we have the ability to control something, we generally try to control it. And the breath is something we certainly have some control over. So if you notice a tendency to try to control the breath, just let that go, let it go, let it go, let it go. And just notice what the breathing is doing. Just noticing the rhythm of the breath, and just maintain that mindfulness of the rhythm of the breath. So that's all we're going to do now is, again, establish a basis of a relaxed body, a relaxed mind, and then just for a little while, just notice the rhythm of the breath, what it's doing. So we'll do a 15-minute practice on that. So let's do that now. Allowing your awareness to descend into the body. And simply become aware of sensations throughout the body. And if you notice any areas of tightness or tension in any part of the body, then use the out-breath to relax and release that tightness or tension. awareness to the area of your face and soften and relax all the muscles in the face. The mouth and jaw, soft and relaxed. And all the muscles around the eyes, soft and relaxed. In this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And then we can take 3 slow, deep breaths, maintaining awareness of sensations throughout the body as you breathe. And then allow the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Not trying to control or regulate the breath in any way. Simply allowing it to flow naturally, effortlessly. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. And then give yourself permission to let go of any hopes or fears, worries or concerns about the past or the future. To give yourself permission to let go of all of these things for the duration of this short meditation. And simply allow the mind to come to rest in the present moment. And simply becoming aware of the rhythm of your breath. Noticing if it's slow or fast, deep or shallow, long or short. Without trying to modify it in any way. So simply noticing the rhythm of the breath. Now if you get distracted from the breath, no need to get upset. In fact, be happy you've noticed you've become distracted. And the very first thing to do is simply relax. Then release the distraction and very gently return to focusing on the rhythm of the breath. So relax, release and return. Keep coming back to the breath again and again, patiently and happily. Again, if you get distracted from the breath, the first thing to do is simply relax. Then release the distraction and very gently return to focusing on the rhythm of the breath. Relax, release and return. Keep coming back to the breath again and again. So we can slowly end this meditation and begin our discussions here this morning. We all want to be happy, and we all want to be free of suffering. And it often seems to us as if the source of our happiness and the source of our suffering is out there in the world. And so as a result, one of the main methods we often use to try to find happiness and to try to overcome suffering is that we try to manipulate the things around us. We try to attract people, places and things that seem to be the source of our happiness. And we try to push away or avoid people, places and things that seem to be the source of our suffering. However, is this an effective strategy? Using this strategy, are we getting any closer to finding genuine happiness? And are we getting any closer to overcoming our suffering? This approach to finding happiness and overcoming suffering in Buddhism is often presented with a presentation called the 8 Worldly Concerns. And these are 4 pairs. One thing we're trying to get, the other thing we're trying to avoid or push away. The first pair is gain and loss. So gain here means material gain, meaning wealth and possessions. So it often seems to us that, to be happy I need more stuff. I need more money, I need more things. Bigger house, a better car, more stuff. More money, more stuff, I'll be more happy. So we put a lot of effort in trying to accumulate material wealth and possessions in the hope that it's going to make us happy. And equally, we feel as if we don't have all this stuff, this wealth and possessions, we're really going to suffer. So we put a lot of effort in trying to avoid losing these things. The second pair is pleasure and pain. And we often tend to equate pleasurable experiences with happiness. Meaning, if I have more pleasure, I'm going to be more happy. So therefore, we put a lot of effort in trying to get more and more pleasurable experiences because we feel the more pleasurable experiences we have, the more happy we're going to be. And also, we tend to equate painful, unpleasant experiences with suffering. So therefore, we put a lot of effort in trying to push away or avoid any unpleasant, painful experiences because for us, that means suffering. More pain, more unpleasant, more suffering. But not only that, we often feel that it's very important for our happiness what people are saying about us. So the third pair is praise and blame. So we feel like if people are praising us more, we're going to be more happy. So we put a lot of effort in doing and saying things that we receive praise from others because we feel like we're going to be more happy if we get all this praise. And then equally, we feel like as if some people are really blaming us for things, particularly things we never did, we're going to suffer a lot. So we try to avoid any situations where people are blaming us for things. But also, we feel that it's important for our happiness not only what people are saying about us, what people are thinking about us. So the fourth pair is good reputation and bad reputation. Again, we put a lot of effort in trying to get a good reputation, that people are thinking and acknowledging us, respecting us and so forth, because we feel like if we have a good reputation, we're going to be more happy. And equally, we feel as if we have a bad reputation, that people are really thinking badly about us, then we're going to suffer more. So we put a lot of effort in trying to avoid having a bad reputation. So basically, we're trying to get more of the things on the left because it seems like that's the source of our happiness. And we're really trying to avoid all these things on the right because we feel like they're the source of our suffering. But again, is this an effective strategy? If this is our strategy, are we getting any closer to finding genuine happiness? Are we getting any closer to overcoming our suffering? And if this is our strategy, then there's a number of reasons why this is very problematic. The first reason if we use this approach, it's problematic, is that it is what's called stimulus-based. That the things on the left come about due to some sort of stimulus. And because it's stimulus-based, then by its nature, it's transient. Because when that stimulus finishes, the pleasant happiness experience finishes. And therefore, also by its nature, it's unreliable. We can't just click our fingers and have these things on the left whenever we want them. They require certain conditions to come together. They're not there, we don't have them. And of course, these things on the left, we have very little control over them. Particularly, we have very little control about what people say and think about us. So if our happiness is dependent on our ability to control external factors, we're in trouble. And also, if we look closely, we can see that these things if the things on the left were really the source of our happiness, it would mean the more that we have of those, the more happy we should become. But if that was the case, it would mean certainly the most wealthy people on the planet must be the most happy, if that's the source of happiness. But we can see that often very wealthy people are not that happy, in fact have a lot of suffering, particularly mental suffering. So these things on the left are not a guarantee of happiness, even if we have them. In fact, they often induce a lot of suffering. The second reason this is all very problematic is that if we really believe the things on the left are the source of our happiness, then we simply end up with craving and attachment for these things. And if we have craving and attachment for the things on the left, particularly pleasure, then together with that craving and attachment comes often a lot of worry and anxiety about not getting it, not getting enough of it, and losing it. And then, of course, together with that comes a lot of frustration when we don't get them. And even if we do get the things on the left, particularly pleasurable experiences, what we often do is we overindulge in those experiences. And of course, we know from our own experience that often leads to a lot of suffering, overindulging in pleasurable experiences. And then, of course, no matter how much we get of them, they never really fully satisfy us. And so we simply end up with a lot of dissatisfaction and disappointment when things don't live up to our expectations. And then, of course, we feel like the reason I'm not happy, I just didn't get enough of those things. I need more. So we end up with more craving and attachment, which just continues the cycle. In fact, I saw not so long ago there was a person who surveyed billionaires, so the mega wealthy billionaires, and he asked them about their level of happiness. And the average response was that they're not actually very happy at all. Yet, the average response was that if they had 25% more money, they'd definitely be more happy. So they still felt like money was the source of happiness, and that, 2 billion or 5 billion was not enough, but if I have another 1 billion, I'm going to be more happy. And of course, craving and attachment, we can never be satisfied. Because craving and attachment's always looking for something bigger, better, and different. And we know this from our own experience, that often, if there's something we enjoy and we get it too often, after some time, our craving and attachment goes, sorry, that's not good enough anymore. I need something bigger, better, and different. So we actually end up losing out on the things we used to enjoy because our craving and attachment says it's not good enough anymore. And so just as this approach leads to attachment to the things on the left, it also leads to aversion to the things on the right. Particularly aversion to pain, anything unpleasant, because we feel like that's the source of our suffering. And so what does that aversion bring us? Well, what it does, of course, together with that, we have a lot of worry and anxiety about meeting these unpleasant things on the right, which just causes, again, a lot of suffering. And studies show that 95% of the things we worry about never eventuate anyway. But already we're suffering with the worry and anxiety and the fear. And that aversion, all that does is it magnifies our suffering. And this was clearly shown in a study they did a few years ago. It was a study about pain. And they had a number of participants in the study, and each participant had I think it was some sort of like heat pad on their leg that produced a lot of heat that was quite painful. And what they did was they asked the participants to continually monitor their level of pain from a scale of 0 up to 100. And just to keep reporting how much pain they were experiencing. And initially, the average response was a pain level of 66. And then at the same time, they had an intravenous drip in their arm. And initially, it was just some saline solution going in, so nothing. But then what they did was they started introducing painkiller without telling anyone. But they kept asking them, what's your level of pain? And then you would expect the number should go down, and it did. It went from 66 to 55. And now here's where it starts to get interesting. So they still kept giving them painkiller, but now they told them they were getting painkiller. So nothing changed, but magically 55 went to 39. But now here's the really interesting part. They kept giving them painkiller, so nothing changed, but now they told them, we're going to stop the pain killing. 39 went to 64. So it was people's aversion to pain that created a lot of suffering. So the more aversion we have, the more suffering.
Sorry.
Yeah, let me just finish. And there's another reason it's problematic, this approach. Is that if we use this approach, we simply end up being trapped in the hope-fear cycle. Hoping for pleasant experiences, fearing or worrying about unpleasant experiences. In other words, having attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things. And all that does is it just creates more suffering. And this is very nicely summarised by a great Indian Buddhist master, Shantideva, from the 8th century, and he says, and he's talking about this approach, he says, those seeking to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery, and with the very desire for happiness, out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy. And this approach is very much what's called a materialistic a view of life, gathering material things. And this approach is also quite well known in psychology as not very useful. In fact, I've got a quote here from a psychologist in a book called The High Price of Materialism, and he says the following. Existing scientific research on the value of materialism yields clear and consistent findings. People who are highly focused on materialistic values have lower personal well-being and psychological health than those who believe that materialistic pursuits are relatively unimportant. Question?
Didn't understand the third problematic.
You didn't understand what, sorry?
The third.
Third, yeah.
Yes, please.
So, this first one, of course, is, again, we feel like material wealth, more money and possessions we have, we're going to be more happy. And then we really do often equate pleasure with happiness. We feel like the more pleasurable experiences I have, the more happy I'm going to be. But we also feel like it's important for our happiness what people are saying about us. So therefore, we feel like it will be more happy if people are praising us for good things. So we put a lot of effort in getting praise from others because we feel like the more praise we get, the more happy we're going to be. But not only do we feel that it's important for our happiness what people are saying about us, but what people are thinking about us. So that's the fourth one, good reputation. So we put a lot of effort in doing things where we end up with a good reputation. People respect us, acknowledge us, and so forth, and think good about us. Any other questions about 8 worldly concerns?
I'm noticing that this can get kind of murky sometimes, especially like for my generation of females, because we were taught not to assert ourselves and to think, well, I'm getting caught up in the 8 worldly concerns, but then we let people mistreat us. And so it's sometimes really hard to navigate that.
Exactly. Very good point, and I'm going to start to address it right now. and we'll address it in a number of different ways in the coming days, because this is a very important point, because generally we fall to two extremes. Both of them are harmful. You know, you said we shouldn't assert ourselves. So people feel like asserting ourselves is doing this, and not asserting ourselves is we're sitting there as a doormat and people walk over the top of us. These are the two extremes. We're not talking about being a doormat. In fact, that's, from a Buddhist perspective, is not helpful for us or anyone else. But we need to clarify there. Because often people feel there are two choices, and both of them are not good. But Buddhism says no, both of those choices are extremes. There's a middle way between those two extremes. And that's what we're going to slowly now start to discuss. What is this middle way? Yeah.
So when you talk about praise or good reputation, they often act as positive reinforcement for doing good deeds, let's say. So is that bad?
That's my very next point. So let's go to my next topic then. So the Buddhist assertion, of course, is that what is the solution to this is that the Buddhist assertion is that we're just looking in the wrong place. The source of our happiness and the source of our suffering is not anywhere out there to be found. It's within our own mind. And so therefore, together with this presentation, then you often hear people saying, within a Buddhist context, we are to give up the 8 worldly concerns. And then people, when they hear that, they go, ooh. And this giving up the 8 worldly concerns is often presented using a word, renunciation. So renunciation, of course, means to renounce. It means to give up. And this is presented as the door of entry into the Buddhist path. And when people hear that, they sometimes go, ooh, I don't think I want to become a Buddhist. Because this renunciation, giving up 8 worldly concerns, seems to imply that as a Buddhist it's bad or wrong to have lots of money, to have a lot of pleasure, to be praised and have a good reputation. I need to give those up. We're talking about giving up the 8 worldly concerns, not the 8 worldly things. Whether or not we have a lot of money and pleasure and praise and good reputation is not the important point. The important point is our attitude to these things. So when Buddhism talks about renunciation or giving up the concerns, what it's saying is to give up the idea that these are the source of happiness and these are the source of suffering. I.e., to give up craving and attachment for the things on the left, to give up aversion to the things on the right. Or in other words, to give up an unhealthy attitude to these things. Because that unhealthy attitude is just going to create more suffering. So, therefore, again, having lots of money or pleasure or being praised or having a good reputation is not the point. The point is, what is our attitude to these things? And so that's what this word renunciation is about, is giving up this unhealthy attitude. By understanding that the source of happiness and suffering is not out there, it's within our own mind. And actually, this is a very good example of how terminology can create a lot of confusion. I think I briefly mentioned that yesterday evening. Is that one of the things that often creates a lot of confusion when people hear some Buddhist ideas or read a book about Buddhism is terminology difficulties. Because again, there are a lot of terms in Sanskrit. The Sanskrit terms were very precise in meaning. But often in English there's no word that has the same meaning, and so then the translator's forced to pick a word that's sort of similar, but often that English word has a lot of other different meanings, and so when we hear that we assume it means that when it actually means something often quite different. So therefore, as I mentioned yesterday evening in this course, when we introduce very important Buddhist concepts, I'll go back to the Sanskrit term and give the etymology of that term. What is the precise meaning of that term? And here's an example. This word renunciation is coming from the Sanskrit term nihsarana. And nihsarana can be divided into two. Ni is like a prefix that means out of, away from. And sarana is coming from the root sir, meaning to move. So nihsarana is the aspiration or wish to move out of, to move away from suffering to happiness. So actually nihsarana is the aspiration for liberation from suffering. Understanding, of course, the source of suffering is within ourselves. This word renunciation doesn't really have that meaning. And in fact, using this word as a translation is actually not a very good translation at all. But someone quite some years ago decided it was a good word and it sort of stuck. And so now we see it a lot. So when you see the word renunciation, what it really means is the wish to be liberated from suffering. Understanding that the source of suffering is within ourselves. And it's not about giving up money, pleasure, praise or good reputation. Questions about that?
I think the maybe fear behind the term renunciate is extreme, because also like you see like the highest people in any religion, like going into a cave is the best way to achieve this. And you see like, okay, if I go 12 years in a cave then, and renounce my family and my loved ones, and then I'll definitely attain enlightenment.
Again, this word renunciation is not about giving up any things. It's not about giving up money, family, pleasure, if we do that, we'll be even more miserable. Because we haven't changed our attitude at all. All we've done now is we've denied ourselves those things. We haven't changed anything. And we're just going to suffer even more. So again, renunciation is not about giving up anything. It's about giving up concerns. It's about giving up unhealthy attitudes. It's about giving up attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things. That's what the word renunciation means. It doesn't mean let's give up everything and go off and run off and live in a cave for the rest of our life. That's not renunciation. In fact, if you think that's what renunciation, you'll run off to the cave and 2 weeks later you'll run back. Because that's no solution to anything. Because all you've done is you've cut yourself from those things. You haven't shifted anything. You're still looking there. And if you're looking in a cave out there for happiness, there's not much to be found in a cave out there.
So why is that part of the life of an ascetic?
Again, if that's what an ascetic is doing, they're just going to be miserable. An ascetic, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, is that if we really want, what we need to do is we need to work on our mind. We need to transform our mind. So we need to find some good conditions to be able to do that. And so that's what really we're talking about. How can we find good conditions that we can work on our mind? And for most of us, those good conditions are not running off and living in a cave. I guarantee for probably just about everyone in this room, that's not a good plan. Not a good plan. Because it's too difficult for us. It's not good conditions for us. But more we'll talk about later.
It's kind of sounding like it's relating to accepting the reality as it is. Is this similar?
Right. This is a very good question. I'm going to talk more about this later, this idea of acceptance.
Cool.
And the short answer now, and we'll talk more about it later, acceptance does not mean resignation. Acceptance doesn't mean, oh, it's all hopeless, I give up. That's nothing to do with acceptance. That's resignation. We're still caught up in this. Because resignation is that this is the answer, I can see it's not working, it's hopeless. That's not that's nothing to do with acceptance. In fact, that's the opposite of acceptance. But what really acceptance means, we'll talk about.
A further question on renunciation. Say if a monk or nun has successfully transferred his or her mind, should he or she go back to his family?
Right. Again, a short answer, and we'll talk more about this later, is just shaving our head and putting on some robes doesn't transform anything. Well, it maybe transforms our physical appearance because we've got no hair anymore, but that's it. It doesn't mean that magically now their mind is transformed. So whether you're a monk or nun or not, we still have to do the work. Yeah, and we'll talk more about this later. Yeah, it'll come later. So therefore, we need to know if we really want to overcome suffering and find happiness, then we need to know what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, and how do we eliminate those causes. Because if we don't know those three things, how are we going to overcome suffering? Similarly, if we want to find happiness, we need to know what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness, and how do we cultivate those causes? Because if we don't know those three things, then wishing for happiness is just words with no meaning. Wishing to be free of suffering is just words with no meaning. And that's what this course is all about, is exactly this is the framework we're going to use. We're going to discuss what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, how do we eliminate those causes? What is happiness, what are the causes of happiness, how do we cultivate those causes? And this is, of course, the very first thing the Buddha taught when he achieved enlightenment, called the Four Noble Truths, the foundation of all Buddhist traditions, and that's the framework we're going to use for this entire course. And so what I'd like to briefly do now is briefly talk about what is happiness. We could talk about two types of happiness. The first one is called temporal happiness, which is just another name for our pleasurable experiences. And what we've just seen is that this type of happiness is what's called stimulus-based happiness. Meaning, we require a certain stimulus, and then we have a pleasant experience. So therefore, it's often called what's called conditioned happiness. Meaning we need certain conditions to come together for us to have the pleasant experience. So as we just mentioned before, therefore, this type of happiness is temporary, transient. Because when the stimulus finishes, the pleasant experience finishes. And also, it's unreliable. Because we can't just click our fingers and have a pleasant experience whenever we want one. It requires certain conditions to be there. Not there, no pleasant experience. And then if we look at our pleasant experiences a little bit deeper, we can see they're not even in the nature of happiness. Because if our pleasant experiences were in the nature of happiness, it would mean the more we engaged in them, the more happy we should become. But we know from our own experience that often when we overindulge in our pleasant experiences, not only don't they make us more happy, but they often induce a lot of unnecessary suffering. For example, eating too much of our favourite dessert, staying too long out in nice warm sunshine, and so forth. So what we can understand is that our pleasurable experiences are simply relative experiences. And that if we overindulge in them, they themselves actually turn into suffering. So that's the first type of happiness. And then we can talk about what's called genuine happiness, this state of inner well-being. And this type of happiness is not stimulus-based. Meaning we can be in this state of genuine happiness regardless of what's going on around us. It doesn't require certain stimulus to be present. Therefore, it's what's called unconditioned happiness. Again, we don't need certain conditions there for us to be in that state. We can be in this state regardless of what's going on around us. And therefore, this type of happiness, of course, is stable, reliable, and it is in the nature of happiness. And this temporal happiness, again, is based on the idea that the happiness is coming from out there. So this type of happiness is about what we can get from the world. And having that view, that can lead to competition and conflict. Because I need to get those things from there. Let's get rid of these people here because there's competition for those things out there. So this view really can lead to a lot of competition and conflict. Whereas this view of genuine happiness, really understanding the sources within, is not so much about what we can get from the world, it's what we can bring to the world. And based on this then worldview, that leads to not competition and conflict, but cooperation and support. And instead of this leads to attachment and aversion, this actually leads to loving kindness and compassion. What are the causes of genuine happiness, of course, we're going to be looking at in some detail in this course. Now, we often feel like, or we hope, that this will give us this. We often are hoping that our pleasant experiences are going to fulfill us and satisfy us. And of course they never will. And so if we can understand there are two types of happiness, to distinguish them, then we can strive for genuine happiness. But it's not a choice. And that's often people mistakenly feel. Again, based on this word renunciation. When people hear the word renunciation and they understand that there are these two things, people think I have to give up this, I have to renounce my pleasure. Renouncing your pleasure is not going to do anything except make you more miserable. Again, renunciation is not about renouncing pleasure. It's about renouncing the idea that that's going to make you happy. That, in other words, to renounce or give up unhealthy attitude, i.e. craving and attachment. So it's not a choice. It's not like if we strive for genuine happiness, we give up pleasure. In fact, what you're going to find is that if we are striving for genuine happiness, understanding the source of happiness is within, what you're going to find is you'll understand that pleasurable experiences are never going to fulfill us, which means we're going to let go of craving and attachment for them, which actually means we're going to enjoy our pleasant experiences much more than we ever have done in the past. Any questions about that before I move to the next topic?
Yeah, that last part, how that becomes to make them more pleasurable, I miss it.
We're going to talk about that. So how does giving up craving and attachment to pleasure make it more enjoyable? Well, very simply, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow. If there's something we have strong craving and attachment to, I think generally our mind gets very agitated, doesn't it? And even if we have it, like let's say there's a favourite food, we're so much craving, and we're craving and we've got it, do we actually really enjoy it, or are we just sort of gulping it down? I mean, are we really enjoying it when we have this state of mind? Oh, I need more of this, I've not got enough. I mean, do we really enjoy it with that craving and attachment? I don't think so. So if we can just drop that, we're going to enjoy that food much more. But I'm going to talk more about that tomorrow. Yeah.
Does Buddhism also teach that the space between two desires is where happiness lies?
Does Buddhism teach that the space between two desires, you mean a space as in a time where there's no, I think you mean by desire, you mean craving attachment?
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you mean by space the time where we don't have craving and attachment, of course.
Right, okay.
But simply not having craving and attachment doesn't mean we're automatically having genuine happiness. It just means that at that moment there's no craving and attachment coming up. Which means that if we're still holding on to the idea that the source of happiness is out there, all that's happened is we're temporarily introducing more suffering by the craving and attachment. It doesn't mean that somehow now we've found genuine happiness. It just means there's a temporary space where there's no craving and attachment arising. So we need to do more than that. We need to really shift our perspective. If we don't shift perspective, then at best what that gap can do is temporarily reduce the agitation in our mind, which is a good thing, but that's very limited. So we need to do a little bit more than that. But at least that's better than craving and attachment. Okay, yeah, down the back.
So you said that the second kind of happiness is permanent, it is not based on...
It's what, sorry? I didn't hear. It's what, sorry?
The second kind of happiness,
Yeah,
it is not based on any stimulus.
correct.
And it is permanent, it is not impermanent.
Ooh, okay, first before you go on, we have to be very careful when we hear the word permanent and impermanent. Normally, for us, permanent implies it lasts forever, and impermanent means it just lasts a short time. When we hear the word permanent and impermanent in Buddhism, that is not the meaning. Permanent and impermanent in Buddhism is not telling us how long something lasts. Permanent and impermanent, and actually literally the word coming from Tibetan and Sanskrit is changing and unchanging. So something is permanent if it's not changing from one moment to the next. Something is impermanent if it is changing from one moment to the next. Those words don't indicate how long something's going to last. Because we can have impermanent things that last forever, and we can have permanent things that last that long. So we need to be careful of that. But go on with your question.
Yeah, so then what it means is that this happiness cannot come from any stimulus, right?
Cannot come from any stimulus.
Because it is not based on stimulus.
Yeah, when we're in that state, it doesn't require any particular stimulus, correct?
But to go in that state, would you require a stimulus?
Well, of course we need to do certain practices to get to that point, but what we're talking about, when you're in that state of genuine happiness, you can be in that state regardless of what's going on around you. Of course we need to do things to get there, and that's what this whole course is about.
I was wondering, the suffering word, where it comes from in Sanskrit and the meaning?
That's the next topic after the break. But before that, what I'd like to do is just a brief history of Buddhism first. So when did it all begin, the Buddhist tradition? It began in 563 BC in a place called Lumbini, which is in modern-day Nepal. Maybe some of you have been there. And there a prince was born, Prince Siddhartha his name was, and his father was the king of the region. And when he was born, the wise man of the court prophesied to the king that this boy, this child, would either become the next great king or a great spiritual leader. So of course the father wanted the boy to follow in his footsteps. So in his upbringing in the palace, he surrounded him with all sorts of pleasures of the palace and that sort of life, and trying to educate him to become the next king. But then, as he was growing up, Prince Siddhartha, and of course he was surrounded by all the pleasures in the palace, but he managed to go outside the palace a few times and to see the harsh realities of life. He saw a lot of poverty, a lot of sickness, aging, death, and this really had a strong impression on him. And he also at one time saw a wandering mendicant, someone who seemed to be very much at peace with themselves. So all of these events got the prince thinking about life and suffering and the meaning of life, and can we overcome these sort of suffering? And so he decided he needed to really pursue this. And of course his father was not pushing him in a different direction. So therefore he escaped from the palace at age 29 and he went out in search of the truth. And he met with a number of spiritual teachers, and a lot of the spiritual traditions at that time felt like that the way to be liberated from suffering, that a lot of these traditions really saw that this craving and attachment was really the problem, particularly craving and attachment for the body. So then Prince Siddhartha went into all of these practices of developing these high levels of absorption, because if you do that, your craving and attachment subsides. And one of the things was it was felt like craving and attachment to the body was really a source of a lot of suffering. So the part of the practice was ascetic practices of denying the body, not eating. So he did this for 6 years, to the point where he was on the point of death from malnutrition. And he just realized that at that time that he'd just gone to another extreme. That in the palace he was in the extreme of indulgence, and now he'd just gone to the extreme of asceticism, of denial. So he understood this is not the path to liberation. So he abandoned his teachers and he went out in search of the truth himself. And what happened next is I'd like to read from a book called What Makes You Not a Buddhist, from Dzongzak Khyentse, the author, and this is what he says. He puts it very nicely. The next part of his journey, he says, "Through many years of contemplation and penance, Siddhartha remained steadfast in his determination to find the root cause of suffering and to ease his own suffering and the suffering of others. He headed to Magadha in the heart of India to continue his meditation. Along the way, he met a grass seller named Satya, who offered him a handful of kusha grass. Siddhartha recognized this as an auspicious sign. In ancient Indian culture, kusha grass was considered a cleansing substance. Instead of continuing his journey, he decided to stop and meditate right there. He found a place to sit on the flat stones under a nearby Ficus religiosa tree, using the kusha grass as a mat. Silently he vowed, 'This body may rot, I may disintegrate into the dust, but until I find the answer, I will not rise.' As Siddhartha sat in contemplation beneath the tree, he did not go unnoticed. Mara, the king of the demons, heard Siddhartha's vow and sensed the strength of his resolve. Mara grew sleepless, for he knew that within Siddhartha existed the potential to throw his entire domain into chaos. Being a strategic warrior, he sent 5 of his most beautiful daughters to distract and seduce the prince. As the girls set out, they had full confidence in their seductive talents, but as they approached the meditating Siddhartha, their beauty began to vanish. They withered and aged, they grew warts, and a stench rose from their skin. Siddhartha did not stir. The dejected Apsaras returned to their father, who was furious. How dare anyone refuse his daughters? In his rage, Mara summoned his retinue, a great army furnished with every imaginable weapon. Mara's army attacked in full force, but to their dismay, all the arrows, spears, stones and catapults aimed at Siddhartha transformed into a rain of flowers as soon as they came within reach of their target. After many long hours of unsuccessful warfare, Mara and his army were exhausted and defeated. Finally, Mara came to Siddhartha and with all his diplomacy tried to talk him into giving up his quest. Siddhartha said he could not give up after all these lifetimes of trying. Mara asked, "How can we be so sure that you've been struggling for so long?" Siddhartha answered, "I don't need validation, the earth is my witness." And with this he touched the ground, the earth shook, and Mara evaporated into thin air. Thus Siddhartha found liberation and became a Buddha. He had discovered the path to end suffering at its very root, not only for himself but for all people. The place of his final battle against Mara is now called Bodh Gaya, and the tree under which he sat is called the Bodhi tree. This is the story that Buddhist mothers have told their children for many generations. So of course we can take this story literally and think that there was really a demon called Mara and the 5 daughters in the army, and that Siddhartha vanquished these 3 demons or 3 foes. But actually, as we're going to see very shortly, Mara, the daughters in the army, are symbolising 3 inner demons that Siddhartha overcame in his own mind. And what those 3 inner demons are is we'll start to talk about in some detail tomorrow. So Siddhartha overcame these inner demons. He achieved enlightenment at age 35. So what is enlightenment? Enlightenment is a state where we have eliminated all suffering and its causes, and we've fully developed all the positive qualities such as loving kindness and compassion and so forth. And when Prince Siddhartha achieved enlightenment, he became known as Shakyamuni Buddha. So Buddha, of course, is a Sanskrit term that really means someone who's fully awakened. And Shakyamuni we can divide into 2. Shakya is the clan of people that Siddhartha grew up in. And Muni here has many meanings. Here it means capacity or strength. So Shakyamuni Buddha is the fully awakened one from the Shakya clan who has the capacity or strength to help eliminate the sufferings of others. And then, of course, Shakyamuni Buddha, the Buddha then spent 45 years wandering around India teaching people what he had discovered. And the very first teaching he gave was the 4 Noble Truths. He gave that in Sarnath, near Varanasi. And the 4 Noble Truths is the foundation of all Buddhist traditions. And as I mentioned, the 4 Noble Truths is telling us what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness. And that's the framework we're going to use for this entire course. And actually, and then at age 80, then Shakyamuni Buddha finished his life at age 80. So he spent 45 years wandering around India teaching people what he had discovered. And actually the whole life story of the Buddha is very nicely drawn on the wall here. That whole back section of the wall, which has the green background, has all the elements of the life story of the Buddha from birth, through his palace life, to escaping, to the ascetic practices, to achieving enlightenment, teaching Four Noble Truths and so forth, and then passing into what's called parinirvana at age 80. So it's all very nicely drawn in that section of the wall there. So that's a little bit, very briefly, the story of the Buddha. So it's time for a morning tea break now. So let's have a tea break, come back at 10:45, and then I want to first talk about then how Buddhism spread from India from that time into the various countries. So let's take a tea break first.